It was a humid summer evening in a quiet Seattle suburb when Emily's life shifted without warning. Her mother had remarried only weeks earlier, and Daniel, the man who now lived under the same roof, was supposed to be nothing more than her stepdad. He was polite, steady, a little withdrawn, someone you could easily overlook. But Emily had already learned that sometimes the most dangerous stories don't begin with passion or fire. They begin with silence. Before the story deepens, stay close. Subscribe, leave a like, and let this story keep you company through the night. Your support makes it possible for these quiet tales of family and longing to find their way to new hearts. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Are you in the U.S., maybe on the East Coast where summer storms beat against old windows, or in the Midwest where power lines crackle in the dark? Or are you far away, across the ocean, watching the rain fall in another language, but still feeling the same pull of memory and family? Leave your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far these stories travel. Emily sat at the kitchen table that night, a glass of water in front of her. Daniel was opposite, the newspaper spread open, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. Her mother had already left for the night shift at the hospital, and the house felt larger than it should have, each empty corner echoing with quiet. Emily noticed every small detail: the soft hum of the refrigerator, the slow turning of a page, the way the ticking clock seemed louder when no one was speaking. She told herself there was nothing unusual about sitting across from her stepfather in silence. Nothing at all. And yet, the silence pressed against her like a weight, demanding to be acknowledged. When she stood to rinse her glass, Daniel lifted his head briefly, offered a simple "good night," and returned to his paper. His voice was even, almost flat, but for some reason Emily carried it with her down the hallway, into her room and beneath the sheets. She lay awake long after, wondering why something so ordinary felt charged with meaning. This was only the first evening in a summer that would not end the way she expected. And though she didn't know it yet, every small silence in that house was drawing a line she would eventually be forced to cross. Morning in that house arrived without ceremony. The blinds in the kitchen let in a thin line of gray light, the kind that never quite warms a room. Emily poured herself a cup of coffee, the bitter smell rising with the steam, while Daniel sat at the end of the table with his paper folded neatly in half. He never asked how she slept, never filled the silence with small talk. He simply nodded when she walked in, as though acknowledging her presence was enough. Their routines soon fell into a rhythm. She would leave early for her classes at the university, headphones on, pretending the world outside was larger than it really was. Daniel, already retired from teaching, spent his mornings reading, his afternoons fixing things around the house or mowing the lawn with slow, deliberate movements. They shared the same roof, the same kitchen, even the same grocery lists scribbled onto scraps of paper. And yet, they lived like polite strangers orbiting the same quiet space. At dinner, if her mother was working late, Emily and Daniel ate together without ceremony. He would cook something simple: grilled chicken, chili from a can, macaroni and cheese in a glass bowl, and Emily would take the seat across from him. Sometimes they exchanged a sentence, maybe two. Salt's on your side? Pass the water, but that was all. And strangely, she didn't hate it. The silence between them wasn't heavy like it could have been. It was steady, almost careful, like both of them understood the rules of some unspoken agreement. They would not pry, they would not overstep, and in exchange, the house remained calm. Still, Emily began to notice the smallest shifts. One morning, she realized she was brewing the coffee a little stronger, the way Daniel seemed to prefer it. Another evening, when she packed leftovers into containers, she labeled them with a black marker, one with his name, one with hers, though he had never asked. It wasn't closeness, not exactly, but it was something. Sometimes, late at night, Emily would pause in the hallway outside the living room. Daniel would be there, a lamp glowing beside him, glasses perched on his nose as he underlined a passage in a book. He looked ordinary, perfectly ordinary. Yet she found herself watching a little longer than she meant to, standing in the shadows until she reminded herself to move. These routines, these silences, these glances that lasted a second too long, they didn't feel dangerous. Not yet. But deep down, Emily knew that danger rarely arrived all at once. It seeped in, slowly, in the spaces where people stop noticing how close they've grown. The storm rolled in without warning. the kind that turns the evening sky from pale gray to bruised purple in a matter of minutes. Emily had been at the library all afternoon, and by the time she drove home, the rain was slamming against the windshield so hard she could barely see the road. When she finally pulled into the driveway, she sprinted through the downpour, shoes soaked, hair clinging to her face. Inside, the house was dark except for a single lamp in the living room. Daniel was there, already moving toward the window to check the storm. Thunder cracked so loud the floor seemed to shake, and then, just as Emily kicked off her wet sneakers, the power went out. The silence that followed was heavier than the thunder. Daniel's voice came low, steady. "Stay there, I'll grab some candles." She stood in the hallway, dripping, watching his tall figure disappear into the kitchen. The glow of a match flared, then softened into the flicker of candlelight. He carried one back toward her, set it carefully on the table, and for a moment, the two of them were the only things lit in the room, the flame and the shadows it cast against their faces. Emily tried to laugh it off. "Guess we'll be living like pioneers tonight." Her voice wavered, too thin in the quiet. Daniel didn't smile, but his eyes softened as he placed a folded blanket over her shoulders. "You're soaked. You'll catch a chill." The blanket was heavy, smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. She pulled it tighter, but it wasn't the cold that unsettled her. It was the way his voice carried no hesitation, no awkwardness. He was simply steady, like he had been all along. And yet, standing there in the half-dark, steadiness suddenly felt dangerous. They sat at the table with the candles between them, rain hammering against the windows, thunder rolling overhead. Emily listened to the storm, but more than that, she listened to the spaces between. The scrape of his chair when he shifted, the sound of him clearing his throat before speaking. Little things she never noticed until the world outside went dark. At one point, lightning flashed so close the entire room glowed white, and Emily startled, breath catching in her chest. Daniel's hand moved instinctively, almost as if to steady her, but he stopped short, his palm hovering just above the table. He let it drop back to his lap without a word. She pretended not to notice, though her heartbeat thundered louder than the storm itself. Later, when the lights flickered back to life, Emily felt a strange disappointment. The room looked smaller now, ordinary again. She folded the blanket neatly and placed it on the couch, but the weight of it lingered on her skin. That night, lying in bed, she closed her eyes and tried to forget the warmth of his voice in the dark. She told herself it had been nothing, just a storm, just a blackout, just a blanket. But her chest betrayed her, restless and alive, in a way she couldn't explain. And for the first time, she wondered if silence could be more dangerous than words. The storm had passed, but something lingered in the air after that night. Emily told herself it was nothing, just weather, just darkness, just the way silence can trick the mind into believing it hears more than it should. But the house felt different now, not louder, not colder. Simply closer. On Saturday morning, they went grocery shopping together. It wasn't planned. Her mom had left early again, leaving a note on the counter, "Pick up a few things if you have time." Daniel was already by the door, keys in hand, when Emily walked in with her shoes. Neither of them said they would go together. They just did. The store was busy, carts bumping into each other, kids running down the aisles. Emily stopped at the produce section, holding an avocado in her hand. "These are on sale," she murmured more to herself than to him. Daniel glanced over. "Guess we're making guacamole then." His tone was flat, but something about the way he said it made her laugh a small, surprised laugh that didn't belong in such an ordinary moment. She caught herself, biting her lip as if to hide it. Later that evening, he cooked. Nothing complicated, just chili simmering in a heavy pot, the scent filling the kitchen. Emily hovered near the stove, reaching for the spice rack. "It could use a little more heat," she said, shaking in extra chili flakes. He didn't object. He only slid the ladle toward her, letting her taste first. At the table, she noticed the way he sat. Not at the head, not angled toward her, just quietly present, as though trying to shrink into the background. She found herself studying the details, the silver at his temples, the way he turned his spoon once in the bowl before lifting it, the careful way he set it down. After dinner, she packed leftovers into small containers. Without thinking, She labeled one with a marker Daniel and another Emily. She paused, pen in hand, realizing how domestic the act was, how strange it felt to write their names side by side. But she left the labels anyway, slid the containers into the fridge, and closed the door as though sealing away a secret. Sometimes, late at night, she would step into the hallway and find him in the living room. A lamp glowed beside him, his glasses perched low as he underlined passages in books. He never noticed her there. Or maybe he did, and pretended not to. She lingered longer than she should have, heart quiet but restless, before slipping back into her room. These were small things, ordinary things, groceries, chili, a pen on a plastic lid. And yet, Emily felt them gathering like raindrops on glass, sliding closer together, until one day they would merge into something she couldn't deny. It began the way rumors always do in places where voices carry farther than they should. Emily first heard it at Miller's Diner, the small place on Main Street, where the coffee was always lukewarm but cheap enough to keep the booths filled. She had stopped in for a quick cup before heading to the library. 2 women sat in the booth behind her, their voices low, but not low enough. "You know that girl, Emily? Sarah's daughter? She's living with her stepdad now, just the 2 of them most nights." The other woman chuckled, a sharp, knowing sound. "Well, isn't that unusual? People are starting to talk." Emily froze, her hand tight around the ceramic mug. The clink of ice in a glass, the hiss of the fryer in the back, it all faded, until there was only the sound of their whispers, curling like smoke into her ears. She wanted to turn around, to defend herself, to explain that nothing was happening. But what would she say? That silence can feel dangerous? That a storm and a blanket can change the air in a house? She paid her bill quickly, the waitress raising an eyebrow as Emily's hand trembled with the cash. At home, the tension clung to her. She placed the grocery bag on the counter too hard, the sound echoing. Daniel looked up from the newspaper, brow furrowing. "Everything okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just pulled a carton of milk from the bag and set it down with more force than necessary. Finally, she said, "People are talking." Her voice was sharper than she meant. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, then returned to folding his paper. "They always do," he said simply, as if gossip were weather unavoidable, something you endure until it passes. But it didn't feel like weather to Emily. It felt like a storm aimed directly at her chest. That night, when she lay awake, she thought of the women in the diner, the way their eyes must have flicked toward each other, half smiles hidden behind coffee cups. She imagined the whispers spreading across town at the grocery store, at the church, at the school gates, and she realized that in a place like this, perception mattered more than truth. The next morning, she brewed the coffee stronger than usual. Daniel took a sip, nodded slightly, and went back to his paper. Neither of them mentioned the rumors again. But silence, Emily understood, could never truly protect them. In fact, it might only make the whispers louder. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they settled into Emily's mind, weaving themselves into the quiet spaces of the house. Every glance felt heavier, every shared moment sharper, as if the world outside was watching even when no one was there. One evening after dinner, she stood at the sink rinsing dishes, while Daniel dried them beside her. It was the first time they had worked together in that easy rhythm: water, soap, towel. Their hands moved in parallel, until without warning, their fingers brushed against each other on the rim of a plate. It was nothing more than an accident, but the jolt that ran through Emily made her pull back too quickly, the plate clattering against the sink. "Sorry," she murmured, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Daniel didn't answer. He only set the towel down, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the counter instead of her. The silence between them stretched, fragile as glass. Another night, she had fallen asleep on the couch with her books scattered across her lap. When she woke, the room was dim, the lamp turned low. A blanket covered her shoulders, tucked in carefully. She looked toward the hallway, just in time to see Daniel disappear into his room, the door closing softly behind him. She touched the blanket's edge, warm from his hands, and tried to steady her breathing. And there were other moments, too small to name but impossible to ignore. The way his voice softened when he asked if she'd eaten, the way her eyes lingered on him when he bent to tie his shoes by the door. The way the air seemed to hold its breath whenever they crossed paths in the narrow kitchen. None of it meant anything. That's what she told herself. They were ordinary gestures, accidental glances, harmless silences. But ordinary things don't make the heart stumble. Ordinary things don't keep you awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering why a single brush of skin can replay itself over and over in the dark. Emily knew she should step back, create space, restore the distance that kept them safe, and yet each close call only drew sharper lines around the truth she was trying not to see. The problem wasn't that anything had happened. The problem was how much she wanted to know what would happen if it ever did. It was a Thursday evening when Sarah came home earlier than expected. The front door opened with a jangle of keys, and Emily startled at the sound. She had been standing on the back porch with Daniel, the two of them watching the rain trail down the deck steps. They weren't touching, not even close, but the space between them was small enough to feel noticed. Her mother stepped inside, shaking the damp from her hair. She set her bag on the counter, her eyes flicking quickly between them. "You're both up late," she said, her voice light, but the clatter of her keys against the table was sharper than usual. Emily moved first, brushing past Daniel into the kitchen. "I was just finishing some reading," she answered too quickly, pulling a glass from the cabinet she didn't need. Daniel didn't say anything, only shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking under his shoes. Sarah's gaze lingered. She wasn't a woman easily fooled. Years in the hospital had trained her to read faces faster than words. She poured herself some water, the silence stretching longer than the rain outside. Finally, she spoke, her tone carefully measured. "People notice things. They notice when the story doesn't look right from the outside. You both need to be careful not to give them reasons to talk." Emily's stomach tightened. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but it was close enough to sting. She glanced at Daniel, hoping for reassurance, but his eyes were lowered to the floor. Later, in her room, Emily sat at the edge of her bed, replaying the scene. Her mother's words clung to her like the smell of rain, subtle, but impossible to wash away. She told herself nothing had happened, nothing at all, but that didn't stop the guilt from rising in her throat. Not guilt for what was, but guilt for what she feared her mother had already seen. Down the hall, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, the newspaper unopened before him. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind, steady and heavy. He knew the line, he had always known it. And yet, knowing it didn't erase the way his chest had tightened when Sarah's eyes lingered on them together at the porch door. The house had never felt so small. Every sound, the faucet dripping, the creak of a chair, the wind tapping at the window, seemed louder now, as if the walls themselves had begun to listen. By the end of that week, Emily felt the weight of the house pressing in on her. Every room carried echoes of silence, whispers of suspicion. At the library, she found herself distracted, her eyes sliding over the same sentences without understanding a word. At night, her mother's earlier warning replayed in her mind like a broken record. People notice things. One evening, while folding laundry in her room, Emily made a decision. She would leave. Not forever, maybe, but at least long enough to breathe without feeling every glance, every rumor, every silence closing in. College housing wasn't far, and she could tell her mother it was for convenience. No one would question that. When she finally gathered the courage to speak, Daniel was in the kitchen, drying his hands after washing the dishes. The air smelled faintly of dish soap and lemon, ordinary and harmless, and yet her voice trembled as she said, "I think I should move out, into the dorms, or maybe an apartment near campus. It makes more sense." He turned, drying towels still in his hands. For a long moment, he didn't answer. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw tightened just slightly. "Because of the talk?" he asked at last. Emily swallowed hard. "Because of everything. It's easier if I go." Daniel set the towel on the counter, his gaze steady but heavy with something unspoken. "This house is big enough for honesty," he said quietly. "If that's what you want, I won't stop you. But don't tell me it's just about convenience." Her throat closed around a dozen words she couldn't say. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was only the rumors, only the looks from neighbors, only the weight of her mother's eyes. But deep down, she knew what frightened her most. Wasn't what people thought it was, what she felt when she was alone in the same room with him. That night, she packed a small bag, then sat on her bed staring at it for hours. She imagined herself walking away, setting her own key on the counter, shutting the door quietly behind her. She imagined freedom. But she also imagined the silence of the house after she left, the steady scrape of Daniel's chair at the table with no one across from him. The clock ticked past midnight. She hadn't moved. The bag remained by the door, untouched. She pressed her palms over her eyes and whispered to the empty room, "I don't know what I want." And the truth was, she didn't. The next morning, the house smelled faintly of coffee and toast. Emily came into the kitchen, her small overnight bag still hidden in her room. Sarah was already seated at the table, hair pinned back from her shift, her eyes sharper than usual. Daniel sat opposite her, newspaper folded but untouched. The silence was thick enough to slice. Emily slid into her chair, heart thudding. No one spoke at first. The tick of the wall clock seemed louder with each passing second. Finally, Sarah set down her mug with a deliberate thud. "We need to talk," she said. Daniel didn't flinch, but his hands tightened around the edge of the paper. Emily's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to meet her mother's gaze. "Daniel," Sarah continued, her voice even, "I trusted you when I married you. I trusted that you would protect this family, not give it reasons to fall apart. People are watching. They notice things." Daniel's reply came slowly, his tone steady but heavy. "I know where the line island." The words hung in the air like smoke. Emily stared at him, waiting for more, for a denial, for reassurance, for anything, but he said nothing else. Her mother's eyes flicked to her next. "And you, Emily? Do you understand what people are saying? Do you see how this looks?" Emily wanted to protest, to insist that nothing had happened, that it was only neighbors and whispers. But the truth caught in her chest. Because it wasn't only the neighbors. It was the way her pulse quickened in the dark during the storm, the way her fingers remembered the brush of his hand at the sink, the way silence had grown into something alive between them. She looked down at her plate, unable to answer. Sarah's voice softened, but the steel remained. "I can't live in a house where I have to wonder." "I won't." For the first time, Daniel met her eyes directly. "You don't have to wonder," he said. "I know the line, and I haven't crossed it." His voice lowered, almost a whisper. "But knowing the line doesn't mean you never see it." Emily felt her chest tighten, as if the whole kitchen had shrunk around her. She realized then that choice wasn't a moment, a single decision made in clarity. It was the slow pull of days and silences, of what you admit to yourself and what you never dare to say aloud. When breakfast ended, the three of them rose from the table without another word. The dishes were left untouched, the coffee cooling in their cups. And in that silence, Emily understood. The line might not have been crossed, but it had already been found and once seen. It could never be unseen. Winter gave way to early spring, but the house remained colder than the season outside. Conversations grew shorter, footsteps quieter. Sarah buried herself in double shifts at the hospital, as if work could keep her from hearing the silence at home. Daniel retreated into his books, his evenings spent beneath the soft lamp in the living room. And Emily floated between them both, carrying the weight of everything unsaid. One evening, she found herself on the front porch, wrapped in a sweater against the chill. The neighborhood was quiet, no gossiping voices, no curious glances, only the faint sound of a train in the distance. Daniel stepped out a moment later, a mug of coffee in his hand. For a long while, they stood side by side, not speaking, not looking at each other, just listening to the night. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "I almost moved out," she confessed softly. "Bag was packed. I even picked the day." Daniel nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the streetlight at the corner. "And why didn't you?" She hesitated, searching for words. "Because leaving felt like running from something I still don't understand." He turned then, his face lined with weariness, but his voice steady. "Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't leaving. It's staying without crossing the line." Emily didn't answer. She only wrapped her arms tighter around herself, staring at the faint glow of the porch light. She knew he was right. They hadn't done anything. And yet, the line between them was no longer a wall. It was a thin thread, one tug away from unraveling. When her mother's car pulled into the driveway a few minutes later, Emily stepped back inside. Daniel followed, both of them careful to keep distance, careful not to let silence become proof. Sarah greeted them with a tired smile, carrying her bag to the kitchen. For a moment, the house looked whole again, as if nothing had ever been wrong. But Emily knew better. She felt it in the rhythm of her breath, in the quiet thrum of her heart. Some stories don't need endings. They linger in the spaces we can't name, where right and wrong blur, and silence says more than words ever could. She went to bed that night, uncertain of what tomorrow might bring. But as she drifted toward sleep, one thought returned to her again and again sometimes. The most dangerous secrets are the ones no one dares to speak aloud.